that I'm excited. Oh, there we go. Thank you so much. So I'll get going because there is so much material I'm excited to share with everyone. Alrighty. So my computer will work with me here. Alrighty, so just starting off, as Dennis said, just sharing who I am and a little bit about my location. I'm Caitlin Kren. I use she and her pronouns. I work mostly in homelessness and housing insecurity with folks experiencing sheltered homeless, working in shelter settings with folks specifically in service programs, supporting people with their mental health, substance use needs, and medical supports as well. Most of my research in my doctoral program has been with both sheltered and unsheltered homeless. My research has encompassed trying to explore folks' access to healthcare and mental health care, and access to using public hygienic spaces. And my personal research matter and what all my research and ultimately capstone will be on is homelessness and civic empowerment. So go ahead. Okay, so my work explores the phenomenon of civic disengagement in housing insecure community and the variety of ways that both the system and one's individual self-concept serve to uphold that lack of engagement. Civic disengagement is systemically generated and is a structural problem upheld by various intersecting forms of discrimination. And then also today, I will make an argument that the problem becomes resident in the individual and how the individual perception of oneself, the collective, and contextual conceptions of the self contribute to the ongoing concern of civic disempowerment and disengagement. And so it's actually really well fitting that I follow Grace in the discussion, although this is a different subject matter, the discussion of systemic oppression and the various ways that it shows up. That's going to be a common theme throughout my presentation as well. So Grace, thank you so much for setting the stage. I feel like our work really goes well together in that regard. Alrighty, and so just to establish some common language, because I will be using some terminology throughout. So first of all, when I'm saying civic engagement, I am mostly referring to voting unless otherwise specified. And so we can note that, and then sheltered homelessness is what I'm referring to for the purposes of this work for the most part, although I will touch here and there on aspects of unsheltered homelessness and where that becomes an issue in civic disempowerment. And then the intersection of these concerns exists across all 50 states and beyond, of course. However, for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to oscillate between these issues nationally, but also within New York City specifically, which is where all my work up until this point has been done. Okay, so just to give everyone some information, the US takes pride in its free and fair elections, but political participation and influence remain unequal and biased in favor of the privileged. Political capital is skewed towards the elite, those with higher incomes, employment, more education. Low voter turnout presents a serious challenge to democratic responsiveness and the ability of leaders to respond to the needs and demands of citizens, especially citizens of particularly marginalized groups with unique needs. And so to get some information out to everyone for the purposes of this discussion, homelessness in New York City has reached the highest levels since the Great Depression in the 1930s. According to the Coalition for the Homeless, as of the last time the numbers were looked at in 2022, this year, there were over 48,000 people sleeping in New York City shelters. And that is, not accounting for the thousands of unsheltered folks that are experiencing homelessness in New York City that sleep on the streets and in public spaces. There's no real accurate measurement of or count of the unsheltered homeless. So unfortunately, I don't have a number on that for you. And then as it relates to the other axis of this discussion, and civic engagement, 60% of people experiencing houselessness are eligible to vote, according to the data that was provided in 2020. And of those 60% of folks that are eligible, only a third of folks are registered to vote, and there is little or no data available about regarding how many folks do in fact exercise their voting capacity when experiencing homelessness. So as I mentioned, there are systemic influences that I'm going to address, as well as then instances or influences that are resident in the individual that contribute to these concerns. So we're going to start off with those systemic influences. So first, to address the intersectional oppression that people experience. It's important to note from the outset that there are many factors that influence the proposed problem, but due to the significant quantity of people experiencing homelessness and the intersectional adversity of houselessness and institutional racism, the housing insecure population is at higher risk for voter disenfranchisement. So these factors are innately intertwined, and these various mechanisms of oppression are things that, when compiled upon each other and compounded, especially in the United States, they are experienced chronically, and they make access exponentially harder depending on what someone's layered adversity within their identity might be. So to begin with these intersectional nature of layered adversity, I'm going to point out a couple of specific pieces of identity. So just some statistics for you. According to the National Coalition for the Homeless, 57% of people that are heads of household and shelter are Black, 32% are Latinx, and 7% are white. And then looking at the other axis of this, when we're talking about voting and these kinds of things, people of Black and Latinx identifying race and ethnicity are folks who are statistically much more likely to be disenfranchised at the polls. So looking at the other axis of that issue here, 1 in 16 Black Americans cannot vote due to various disenfranchisement laws, and we're going to get into that a little bit more. And counties with larger minority populations statistically have fewer polling sites and fewer poll workers per voter. And then in 2018, during the 2018 national midterms, Latinx and Black Americans were twice as likely than their white counterparts to be unable to get off of work to be able to go exercise their right to vote. Speaking to the ways in which, again, the privilege of something like employment and the education that comes along with different tiers of employment contributes to people's access to be able to be civically engaged. So there are dozens of other oppressive intersections that may not be addressed directly throughout this discussion, but it's necessary to mention that these factors include housing insecurity, race and ethnicity, as noted, food insecurity, disability status, and more. So voter suppression efforts and homelessness. So experiencing homelessness presents heightened vulnerability to certain voter discrimination and suppression tactics. So I'm just going to explain a couple of those really quickly, and the way in which, as we all see across the country, voter disenfranchisement that's been happening lately in very pointed ways at groups that are increasingly vulnerable in today's political climate. These things are compounded when also when a person, an individual or family is also experiencing housing insecurity. Okay, so first, voter roll purges. So purging eligible voters from the rolls for illegitimate reasons or based on inadequate data is something that happens quite often. And people are, this is often done when people are not notified at all and learn only when they go to vote that they in fact are no longer eligible to vote based on different states' eligibility laws for being able to register in person upon arriving at the polls. People may not be able to reverse that fact. They may just be simply unable to vote in that moment. So a single purge can stop hundreds and thousands of people from being able to vote. One of the most significant tactics for keeping people off the voter rolls is filtering out voters who have changed their address. So this is where this is particularly complicated for people experiencing homelessness, because whether they have recently entered shelter, transferred shelters, are living on the streets, or living with community members, living transiently with family, or whatever the case, this makes them at high risk for being purged from the voter rolls due to the transient nature of their government registered and acknowledged address. The next matter I want to address is redistricting and gerrymandering. This is something that you may have been learning and hearing about a lot in, once again, the disenfranchisement that's happening nationwide. Redistricting follows the census. The census process just happened in 2020, and we are now seeing this as different elections locally and nationally are coming down the pipes with the midterms. And so redistricting follows the census, and the census process often excludes people that are living transiently due to the nature of engaging this population in participation, their participation due to people's the nature of transient living, people being in shelter, and shelters being, systemically excluded from a lot of this process. The housing insecure population often goes undercounted significantly. The problem with the undercount compounds on itself and reinforces the exclusion of those living in shelters and public spaces, and then excludes the population from consideration during the redistricting process. So I would argue that this effectively robs folks of their representation in Congress, state legislatures, city bodies, city governing bodies, et cetera. So the next couple of, when I mentioned earlier also that intersectionality of adversity, another couple of pieces I want to address are criminal justice system involvement. A lot of people, people with criminal justice system involvement, history of involvement in the system, this often co-occurs with housing insecurity and homelessness. Historically, rises in homelessness correspond with increases in prison populations. During the war on drugs, the New York State prison population increased by 2.3 times the amount of folks that were previously incarcerated. This is often young, nonviolent offenders, many of whom have mental health and substance use concerns. This, by virtue of their incarceration, it further isolates them from their support systems, their communities, and exponentially increases the likelihood that they'll experience homelessness when they are released from jail. Additionally, this overzealous incarceration system, the war on drugs, has consequences on people's ability to access employment, which then, multiplies their risk of becoming economically insecure and therefore housing insecure, food insecure, et cetera. Homelessness among formerly incarcerated people is a natural consequence of a failed solution to a misunderstood public health crisis in the war on drugs. And as we can see, a lot of that is being revisited in the new mayoral administration in New York City, which is something that we who work with the housing insecure population are working hard to combat now. And so also laws vary state to state, and it's often confusing and harbors significant consequences for violation. So those two combined factors deter people from voting out of confusion and fear of the legality and other consequences of participating in voting if they are have any history of criminal justice involvement. And then people who are differently abled, individuals with disabilities, and have other kind of special accommodation needs are significantly more at higher risk to have challenges in exercising their rights to vote. And so the intersection of this with housing insecurity, 78% of families living with adult children in shelter in New York City, 67% of single adults, and 51% of families living with children who are minors identify as having being differently abled of some variety. And so voter suppression tactics affecting this population include closing down or condensing poll sites, necessitating that people with special needs find safe ways to travel to new locations, negligence in ensuring that poll sites are safe and accessible for individuals who are differently abled, and creating, and this creates barriers that deter disqualified disabled voters from utilizing these spaces, and then as well as there being barriers put in place around the absentee balloting process, which then make it difficult for people to access physically and then access remotely or alternatively. So the next systemic component that I want to address is power. And this ties in with what Grace had shared with us. A factor worth considering is the role of power and the maintenance of such by dominant groups. So to take a bit of a Marxist view on this, it might suggest that the exclusion of the housing insecure community from the civic process is meant to safeguard the political, economic, and other interests of dominant groups. So by establishing barriers and restrictions on the civic participation of marginalized groups, like the housing insecurity and all of those represented within it, within their intersections of identity that are marginalized, the dominant group serves to preserve their interests, and it reinforces existing hierarchies and simultaneously restricts the free participation of marginalized groups and the privileges afforded by the upheld systems. By maintaining systems where the perspectives of the housing insecure are both actively and passively excluded from the process, the dominant group maintains the hierarchy of oppressing those groups. So the next thing I want to just address in that regard is the excluded voices. So this civic suppression of the houseless population affects the collective voice, and the practice of excluding marginalized voices from the civic process also serves to ensure that social capital remains centralized within the dominant group. Controlling their participation also ensures that participants are reinforcing or furthering the allocation of benefits, profits, resources to the dominant group and away from others. This cyclically ensures that those who participate benefit. So therefore, the exclusion of voices and participation serves those who do in fact participate. Dennis, I'm not phenomenal at timekeeping, so can you give me like a 2-minute high sign when it comes? Thank you. Alrighty. So yes, so the passive exclusion. So we see, like I said, we see this exclusion both actively and passively. So actively was, pieces of what was just discussed in that power structure and the disenfranchisement, purging from voter rolls, et cetera. So passively, the maintenance of these power systems are withholding and gatekeeping voter right information, passively permitting disinformation, and evading investment in engagement and information campaigns outside of kind of hegemonic get out the vote efforts, which often do not target the unique needs of the housing insecure, and therefore they often aren't encapsulated in traditional voter registration efforts and GOTV efforts, et cetera. So in New York, homeless families are provided with information about voter registration. They are not provided with information about voter registration throughout the intake process when they are at the intake centers, whether it's for single adults or family, while they're at the intake centers in New York City. They are supposed to be, there's actually legislation on the books that says this is supposed to be a part of the process. So I am speaking from, based on the work that I have done, the qualitative research that I've collected, as well as my own experience working within family shelters. That this information, I have never come across a single client of the quite literally thousands of people that I have worked directly with that have ever been provided this information in shelter, which is a large part of why I wanted to study this matter. As elections approach, there are greater voter registration efforts, small efforts, but extremely few voter registration organizations or efforts are geared specifically towards the housing insecure population. So as a result, the houseless population is often not captured in those efforts, as I mentioned. And then, the permissiveness of the disinformation, as of a study that was done in 2018 that I will cite, 60% of people, this is just of the general population in the United States, stated that they were unsure if their state allows people to vote if they do not have a permanent address. Another problem, of course, is also that varies state to state, and in some instances, even city to city, whether or not people experiencing homelessness who do not have a permanent address, be it sheltered homelessness, the living in a shelter, or living on the street. People do not know if folks can register to vote. So this exclusion from information sharing and voter education networks gatekeeps access to people understanding what their rights are in this regard. And so disinformation and lack of information.
2 minutes.
Woo. Okay, well, in that case, I'm going to lightning round a little bit to get to the individual. And so just a note here on the preservation of epistemic power and epistemological oppression and how that shows up. So lack of access to this information is a functionality of the system serving to exclude and preserve education and knowledge within certain collective dominant groups. And all of this serves to preserve the status quo. So disengagement as it stands is not regarded as a problem. And as such, communities with little social capital and minimal historic involvement in the process, such as the housing insecure community, there is no need for those of us that do have social capital. It is not viewed as a problem that needs to be addressed, and needs that are going unmet that need to be met, and voices that need to be heard. The system works for those who participate. And so there's research out there that historically, until there is interest conversion, this Dafferty theory of interest conversion, until the interests of the dominant group and the marginalized groups align, there will be no action. So it's arguable that the affordable housing crisis in New York City has become so astronomical that it is affecting those that are members of the dominant group. And as such, there is an argument to be made that we may see improvement here. However, there also becomes tiered levels of need and prioritization, even in addressing things within interest conversion. So the individual influences, I'm lightning rounding these, which actually makes a good amount of sense, because this is largely a systemically induced problem. So need prioritization, those of us who with any kind of clinical background might be familiar with Abraham Maslow and his work in the model of human needs and the prioritization. Crash course, your physiological needs are preserved before those of the psychological. So it can be theorized that when you are experiencing housing insecurity and food insecurity, and you are with your children who maybe haven't eaten in a couple of days, aren't properly clothed for the weather to keep them safe and healthy, that voting and being civically engaged is not a priority for you at that moment. So that is one way that we theorize, the problem being resident within the individual. And then shame and stigma. Of course, we understand societal perception of the way that folks are understood, and certain bodies are understood in the way that we are conditioned to understand them. There aren't many people who, when they're young, aspire to grow up and experience housing insecurity, right? It's not something that, and so as such, it is often viewed and presented through a lens of shame and stigma. It is not something that you want for yourself. And as such, when you find yourself in that circumstance, identifying with that group is necessary to be able to, in fact, take meaningful action to empower yourself and that group. So the understanding of the self through a various amount of different theories and self-categorization. These are essentially various ways that I am underscoring the point that I just made. It is within our human nature and our psychological nature to want to identify with the positive aspects of our identity, to want to build upon them, and to try to reject or turn away from the aspects of our identity that society tells us or that we have internalized are, less than for whatever reason. And as such, we understand ourselves counter to stereotypes. Another component of this is temporary identity. When people experiencing homelessness often don't want to identify as homeless within their identity, because that would be an affront to how they understand themselves in many cases. And they understand their identity as homeless as temporary. And as such, people will not register to vote at shelter because they are hoping to get out of there as quickly as possible and forget the entire experience. And as such, that leads to people not engaging and not identifying as part of the group, which is the first step in being able to take initiative and pride in being a part of that group. And as such, also the vulnerable mindset. When something is shamed and has stigma around it, we do not identify with this because it would require the identity or identification of ourselves as inferior or subordinate, according to this theory. And of course, my last point, resident in the individual, is the lack of control and how that translates to a lack of motivation. When something is outside of our control and we feel that there is absolutely nothing that we can do to change it, and history has showed us that there is nothing that has ever been done to change it, it serves to perpetuate a lack of motivation to even make any kinds of attempts, which would be required of the individual to then identify, become a part of a collective that could hopefully create a degree of collective bargaining power and create social capital. So my final point is that when entire groups are left out of the democratic process, our society is not seen in its entirety. The housing insecure population being left out of this process, they are underrepresented, they are not heard. And that is reflected in legislation, that is reflected in resource allocation, that is reflected in societal perception, and so many other things. So as such, my argument is that it is imperative that groups that are historically disenfranchised and left out of this process be called in. And my final note, a little call to action. Voting helps end homelessness, both in terms of the work that I'm doing and in terms of civic empowerment, as well as all of us within our capacity and our agency that we have. If you are someone who identifies as a part of that dominant group who is civically educated, empowered, you have a degree of ability and capacity to be supportive in addressing this issue. And finally, thank you very much. This is my information. If anyone is interested in learning more, collaborating, or has any questions, please feel free to go ahead and take down my information. And that is all. Thank you, Dennis. And I'm so sorry for taking so long.
Thank you, Caitlin. This is such an incredibly important issue, right now. Do we have questions for Caitlin? I guess I'll start out just to get the questions rolling. What brought you to this topic originally?
Yeah, I love answering that question, actually. So I was working in approaching the 2020 presidential election in a tier 2 family shelter in East New York, in Brownsville, Brooklyn. And as the election was steadily approaching, and we as a society were understanding the risks that were at stake and the threats to democracy that have been we have all been seeing on display. I was having conversations with my clients around the shelter. Are you registered to vote? Are you, all these kinds of things, and learned that there is rampant disinformation, misinformation. People were unaware that they could vote while living in shelter. People were unaware that they were eligible to register. People were unaware that they were able to participate also in the census from their location, given that would then count them in the shelter district, which is somewhere that theoretically, by definition, is temporary. And so people had no idea that they could participate in any of these ways, which is a large part of why areas in which shelters are located are often, extremely under-resourced, underfunded, underrepresented, et cetera, for these reasons and so many more. But this was one of the big ones. And so I actually had created a proposal. I have it on my wall in my office because this is one of my most things I'm most proud of. We ended up running 14 different voter empowerment and civic engagement events in all of our shelters. We ended up partnering with the League of Women Voters to bring in voter education and registration spaces. We had these events where we were able to register people to vote. We were able to help arrange transportation for people so that they can exercise the right to vote. We were able to have people apply for absentee balloting. We were able to have people fill out the census. We had developmentally appropriate civic empowerment lessons for children, as well as book drives that were specifically geared towards the empowerment of children who are living in shelter, who are experiencing layered adversity, to understand that from a very young age, kind of flip that epistemic injustice on its head and understand from a very young age that they can and should have a meaningful voice in this process. Sorry for my prop. Believe it or not, that was not planned. It literally is just up on my wall.
Don't be sorry. Your work is incredibly inspiring.
Thank you.
Are there other questions?
Don't be shy.
Other questions? Okay, well,